Copyright Frequency 99. Imprint Frequency 99, Ocala, Florida, USA. All rights reserved. This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual events or persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. Chapter 1. Promotion Ceremony. The echoes of pain and triumph faded from the large circular room on the spaceship. Captain Magnus stood sweaty and shirtless over the promotion ceremony, his chest heaving from the recent exertion. He was not young, but he was fit and strong, his powerful exterior bloodied and bruised from the more youthful combatants. Even so, he radiated confidence. There were many old scars and healed wounds visible on his exposed torso. Today, more officers were seeking promotion than in quite some time. It was good and came from high morale within the crew. The nature of a military career was advancement. However, seeking a promotion to a senior rank while on a ship as remote as reason came with some eccentric rituals. Magnus still followed the old ways. As such, none of the 4 applicants for promotion to ship captain survived the trial. Further, given the vital nature of their current assignment, Magnus had been especially brutal with each of them. His logic: to dissuade others from attempting this challenge on this tour of duty. As always for Magnus, the strategy of his actions provided multiple advantages. Allowing the challengers work to eliminate 2 high-ranking political rivals, exposing 2 other political adversaries from the lower ranks he had not been aware of. All 4 were dead now, their deaths serving to reinforce Magnus as the dominant prime on the ship and remind the entire crew that they served at his discretion. An ensign brought him a towel, and he wiped the sweat and blood from his face and upper body. Looking out over the crew, he spoke loudly. Next, we have an application for the first officer, waving his hand dismissively to indicate his first officer, Commander Thalia. Unlike Magnus, Thalia was younger. Like Magnus, she was brutal and nasty when she had to be. They were both excellent officers. Their challenging and demanding standards did not conflict with recognizing a job well done or rewarding bravery and excellence when it was present in the crew. Those traits allowed them to indulge their dark side at times. They knew that the loyalty of their crew allowed them to command latitude when necessary. Commander Thalia walked to the middle of the circular floor. The crew rustled in anticipation, all standing at ground level, creating a border to the fighting area. Magnus watched from above, proud of his second-in-command, knowing she would follow his lead and make it clear to the crew that now is not the time for a change in leadership. Thalia had been Magnus's first officer for several Mashi cycles. She, of course, challenged him for command early on, but she did it the right way, in port, between assignments. He had beaten her badly in the challenge, but not so badly that she could not return to duty after a few weeks. Since then, they had developed a deep bond. He trusted her now like he did few other officers. She was loyal to a fault and comfortable as his first officer. She got to do more and learn more following him than she would have in any other position, even her own command. This time, the challenger for Thalia's position was another female, big and strong, but not a prime. Her name was Graciela, and she mistakenly believed that the opportunity to ascend the command ranks was based on physical strength alone, not understanding that fighting with strength was a portion of the required tools. Experience and intelligence were just as necessary. A leader must be strong and know how and when to use that strength and when to use other means. Thalia did not take the challenge lightly. She knew that Graciela had never lost a fight so far. She also knew that Graciela was an excellent security officer and trained combatant. As the challenged, Thalia had the option to select the type of combat and the weapons used. She selected hand-to-hand with no other weapons. This might prolong the match some, but it also could provide the best example to the crew. Graciela was full of misplaced confidence, believing Thalia chose the format out of concern for personal injury. Both women stripped to the waist as Magnus had earlier. The fight would be brutal but fair. Thalia's torso was trim and wiry, riddled with similar, though not as many, scars to Magnus's, resulting from a long and successful military career. Graciela was more muscular and much heavier. She did not carry any scarring or other battle wounds, apparently escaping earlier combat situations with no permanent markings. Both assumed a fighting stance on either side of the circle. Thalia half waved an arm to indicate that the trial had begun. The crowd cheered at the start of the contest. The tendons and thin, corded muscles in Thalia's arms and shoulders stretched as she changed to a defensive stance. As soon as Graciela saw the change in stance, she charged forward, applying her training to always assume the initiative, especially if you sensed weakness in your opponent and believed you were stronger. She started an attack designed to stun Thalia by striking her in the solar plexus, a quick, aggressive move that would allow Graciela to strut about the arena and make a show of accepting her new position as the ship's first officer, and to inflict other punishment upon Thalia if she saw fit. Graciela knew the standard counter from Thalia's defensive position would be a high block with an attempt to swing around and apply a chokehold, moving over her shoulders to her back. A coward's move if there ever was one, but necessary for the smaller and weaker Thalia, Graciela reasoned. She saw Thalia move as if to counter this way and committed all her strength to land a devastating blow. Instead, Thalia suddenly was gone right when the blow should have landed, dipping below Graciela's mighty swing, dropping her body and delivering a stunning punch to Graciela's upper body center mass. She delivered the attack that Graciela had attempted. Graciela was stunned, but momentum still had her fully committed and moving forward. Thalia used Graciela's weight, sweeping her legs out from under her as Graciela stumbled forward and fell face first, gasping for air and holding her stomach. Thalia continued her spin in a single fluid motion, rotating onto her opponent's back on the way to the ground. In a flash, she had Graciela's head above the neck. She focused the energy from her spinning torque to rotate the head all the way around backward by a full half rotation. The neck made a loud snapping sound, and instantly Graciela was dead, staring backward up at the rafters. A look of shock immortalized on her face. The entire fight had only taken a few micros. By all appearances, Graciela had charged Thalia and been instantly disabled and killed. Thalia stood and saluted Magnus as the crowd roared. She had intended to allow the fight to take more time, so she could brutally beat Graciela and make the point concerning promotions away from port as a lesson for the crew. She had not done that, and a small part of her was concerned that Magnus would be upset by it. He was not in the least. The victory was everything he preached, using intellect first and power second, keeping the initiative and deceiving your opponent into believing they were the ones acting with the advantage. Magnus returned the salute and threw his bloodied and sweat-soaked towel down to Thalia. He was seen by all as honoring her victory. She caught the towel as it fell, raising it above her head and turning in a circle to the crew while holding it up in the air, proclaiming victory for all to see. The crew continued to cheer. They would have cheered for Graciela too. It is always wise to cheer for your superiors at these ceremonies, whoever they may end up being, and today was no different. Chapter 2: Protection. The ship flew fast and steady near the outer edge of the dominant circle. The luminary included the lesser circle, a few uninhabitable hot planets too close to the luminary to be usable. The dominant circle, including a dozen planets and moons that were perfect for habitation, and a half-dozen other non-dominant circles farther out, with dozens, into the hundreds of planets and moons, good for mining and colonies. Machi was their home moon, one of 5 that orbited the giant, round ice planet Taio, the dominant planet in the dominant circle. Taio had as moons all the original homes for each of the 5 races. The MDF Reason, a Machi Defense Force MDF vessel, was a gunship, not as large as a destroyer, but with near the same armament, meant for heavy fleet engagements, artillery, and rocket support. Gunships also made excellent enforcers, able to dominate most one-on-one situations with pirates or criminals. The dominant circle was civilized and well-regulated. It was home to civilization in every meaning of the term. The moons each had their own military and civilian law enforcement agencies. Outside of the dominant circle, there were still many desirable locations, hundreds actually, some with their own small governments and military, others as smaller parts of larger enterprises, be they corporate mining and production, outlaw pirate and privateer, or organized crime, each having roots in one of the 5 moons of Taio. Their patrol would take them close to Aegir, a small moon orbiting the massive gas giant Pawan. The moon was a favored entertainment city and a known trading post for black market minerals and tools, a place where rogue corporations and industrious privateers came together to conduct commerce, near invisible amongst the resort-like activities and amenities of the moon. Aegir, which was only about 1,000 measures in circumference, had its own local government and law enforcement. It did not have a military or militia. Instead, it was under the protection of Machi as a settlement. Machians could freely travel and live on Aegir, and many did. It was an excellent destination with good weather and a lot to do if you had the resources. Sending Machi warships to patrol in this area was a show of authority. However, for Magnius, there was a lot of work to do here in addition to the patrol. As the captain of an MDF ship, he was expected to bring in tribute revenues. This was not an official government function, but it was part of how the military operated. The MDF reason was in a military chain of command, assigned to a squadron with revenue goals, part of a division that had revenue goals, and so on. As the captain of a gunship, Magnius was a crucial earner in the fleet. His superiors were both earners and collectors. He did not mind the system, and there was enough skim to go around for him and his direct reports. The system worked like a well-oiled machine. Here on Aegir, he had 2 tributes to collect. The first, from the local government, would be easy. They appreciated the protection the military offered and made enough in taxes and travel visas to still be fat on the back end, even after paying the fleet for protection. The second tribute was always more trouble. The rogue industries and the operators of the black market did not have the same philosophy as the local government. They frequently needed reminding that the protection the fleet offered was often both active protection and passive protection. Active in helping to fight off an outsider, passive by not having an MDF officer get interested in a local business or insert themselves into the local economy. This second tribute was also more critical. It was a year's worth of revenue and a collection of blackmail datagrams on every dignitary and politician who had stayed on Aegir over the past year. This included Machians and dignitaries from all the 5 moons. It also included military leaders. While Magnius had not come to Aegir, others in his chain of command had. Ensign Reed, the communications officer, noticed the red light on her terminal. A red light on the communication panel indicated an external message. "Sir," she spoke loudly as she had been trained, "there is an incoming message for you. The header says it is from your old friend Stuart." Magnius looked over to the communications station from his command station. All the workstations on the bridge were standing-only stations, including Magnius's as captain and Thalia's as first officer. He then looked at Thalia and raised an eyebrow. Commander Thalia spoke to Ensign Reed directly. "Ensign, please find out if it is Fat Stew or Skinny Stew that is sending the message request." Reed did not miss a beat and sent the inquiry. She had been on the reason long enough to know not to insert her curiosity into any official bridge communication. A reply came almost instantly. "Yes, ma'am, it is Skinny Stew making the request." A small amount of tension cleared in the air. Magnius half nodded to Thalia and walked over to the bridge entrance. She moved to meet Magnius at the entrance. "Brenson, you have the bridge," Thalia informed him. Brenson was a security officer. He was also the officer on watch, making him third in command on the bridge even though more senior officers were on board. "Yes, ma'am," Brenson said while coming to attention quickly, then moving over to the command station where Magnius had been standing. Magnius and Thalia walked side by side down the long corridor leading away from the bridge and the rest of the ship. Here and there, a crew member snapped to attention, stepping out of the way of the two, putting their back against the bulkhead as Magnius and Thalia walked past. "Fat Stew is easier to deal with," Thalia finally said, more banter than inquiry. Magnius looked at her and smiled a menacing smile. "Ready?" he asked. They stopped walking at about the midway point of the ship. There was no crew around. Thalia nodded to Magnius, then made a hand gesture over a wrist device, then nodded to Magnius again. He made a similar motion to the one Thalia had made. "Skinny Stew, this had better be important." It came out gruff and angry in tone, although he quickly gave Thalia a reassuring smile. A new voice echoed in. Both Magnius and Thalia were patched into the message feed. "Commander Magnus," The jovial voice said, "It has been far too long." Thalia broke in instantly. "That's Captain Magnus, Stewart." Her voice sounded even more threatening than Magnus's just had. Skinny Stu did not miss a beat. "And I can take from your tone that you are now Fleet Admiral Thalia?" It was not a serious question. "Stewart," Magnus spoke again, sounding commanding, "you have 5 micros to tell me what this is about, or I will assume you are delinquent and need another example." Nothing changed in Skinny Stu's voice, which was still mocking. "Commander Captain, sir, there is a new player in town that would like to meet you in person." "We don't do requests," Thalia interjected. "Fleet Admiral, ma'am," Skinny Stu said, his voice possibly showing just a little stress on the edges. "I can assure you this is no request." Chapter 3. Skinny Stu. The small moon Aegir was a technological marvel. Like dozens of other small moons in the luminary, the Mashi installed an atmosphere along with temperature and gravity regulators. What resulted was a beautiful, manufactured paradise. Captain Magnus and Commander Thalia stood with a contingent of 10 Space Marines outside the home of Skinny Stu. It was a lovely country house, and the military presence in the civilian neighborhood looked out of place. Where Magnus had been feigning irritation earlier, he was actually irritated now. Stewart had kept them waiting for longer than necessary, a sign of disrespect, which did not bother Magnus. But what potentially did bother him was that it felt like there would be a problem collecting the tribute and the information datagram. Magnus waited as patiently as he could. He knew Thalia and the security detail could feel his frustration, as it was keeping the entire group on edge. Eventually, an attractive female ethereal, an E1, opened the door and invited Magnus and Thalia into the residence. "The soldiers will have to wait outside," she said with no fundamental concept of the impact of the words she used. E1 units were very advanced in their own right. Still, they were the first generation away from androids, so they did not have sophisticated interpersonal coroutines like the later models. Magnus pushed the E1 unit out of the way with a forceful shove of his left arm. The impact was jarring and would have severely injured a bio. The unit fell to the ground and slid backwards several measures into the room, her feet going up in the air as she slid on her backside. The Space Marines rushed into the house and formed a perimeter around the several people seated in a social room with oversized cushioned chairs and couches. There was music playing from a playback device on the wall, and the room was filled with luxury foods and beverages. The back wall was see-through. The view outside was of more houses in the neighborhood, along with the stunning starscape. The reason was visible also, hanging in the dark sky far off in the distance as it orbited Aegir. An extremely fat man was sitting in an oversized chair, and 3 smaller men, all cut from the same mold, seated near him. The fat man was Skinny Stu. Magnus did not recognize the other men in the room. Magnus drew his side shooter and fired a shot into the device playing the music. It sparked for a moment, then the music stopped. Skinny Stu jumped at the noise and sudden action, putting his hands out. "Whoa, hold on, man," he said with his arms raised while backpedaling. With him, the 3 men made an aggressive move, reaching into their suits for something while jumping to their feet. Magnus shot each one in quick succession. Blood splashed out with each hit, spraying Skinny Stu in the room, ruining the nice decor. Skinny Stu stopped backing up and looked genuinely infuriated. "What in all that is holy are you doing, man? Do you know who they were?" The Marines rustled forward, surprised by the shots, but ready to engage should there be any attempt at retaliation. Thalia activated her arm bracings, the bare metal instruments snapping out of her uniform from nowhere. Magnus looked around the room as though he was seeing it for the first time and gave a look of mock surprise directed at Stewart. "Were they not the new players you mentioned to me?" he said to Stewart in a very harsh and deadpan voice. "No, you dumb, flat-footed soldier. They were my protection detail for when the others get here." Stewart was visibly upset, not at the loss of his men. Still, it seemed at the thought of not having protection present, and he seemed more scared of these new players than he did of Magnus, which had Magnus curious for the first time in a while. Magnus walked over to Stewart and stood closer to him than he needed to. It was an intimidating move. "Stewart, go ahead and give me the datagrams now." He wanted to get the exchange out of the way. The money was necessary also, but that would be transferred via the network. The datagrams were too valuable to be put onto the network under any conditions. "That's what I wanted to tell you, man," Skinny Stu pleaded. "The people we are meeting already have them." Magnus gave Stuart a look that suggested this was the wrong information to give him if he valued his life. Skinny Stu started to perspire. "I didn't give the datagrams to them, man. I am the one here on your side, trying to make a deal to get them back. I get it, no worries. They took them from Fat Stu yesterday." Magnus snorted. He looked around the room, looking hard at everything for the first time. Blood and guts were everywhere, and the air developed a copper smell, the smell of blood. The E1 unit that had opened the door came into the room. Skinny Stu motioned to the mess in the room, and the ether reel started to clean up. It would probably take a day or two. Skinny Stu said to her, "When they get here, please direct them to the back outdoor sitting area." The E1 unit stopped what it was doing and nodded, then returned to its work. As the three remaining people started to walk to the backyard, Thalia said, "Stuart, speaking of Fat Stu, did you eat him or something? Because you have gained some serious weight." A casual comment, out of place given the carnage they were walking around to get out of the house and into the backyard. Skinny Stu just looked at her sideways. "These bastards were about to ate him, not me," he said, starting to perspire even more. Thalia and Magnus exchanged a set of shoulder shrugs. "Well, they should be full then," Thalia said to no one in particular. Chapter 4, New Players. The backyard area of Skinny Stu's house was extensive, mimicking a country estate back on Mashi. Magnus had the captain's shuttle, the small ship they had taken from Reason to Aegir, repositioned from the front of the house to the back, so it was available if he needed it, and so whoever it was coming could not use the rear area to park their craft, thus taking a tactical advantage away from them. The small shuttle was a wartime craft. It had its own shield array and enough firepower to handle any local, non-military situation. Magnus decided he would wait and see who these other players were. As he had done just moments ago, his normal inclination was not to place himself in a situation that he did not control, and if finding himself in one, to quickly retake the initiative. Just like in the lessons from the earlier promotion ceremony, he knew strength had its place, wisdom and strategy were a balance to force. The lesson that Magnus was often working to convey to his crew was that success in warfare depended on these three elements, not just one. Strength without wisdom was disorganized. Wisdom without strategy was fear. Strategy without strength was foolhardiness. Only by assuming your enemy was stronger than you, smarter than you, and braver than you could you bring your full mettle to bear. To win in any engagement, you had to be everything you could be, every time. He had been taught these lessons through much pain and suffering. He was not against pain and suffering, but he believed the lessons could be taught to those capable of understanding them without the same trials he had endured. And he had proof he was correct. Commander Thalia had learned quickly. She would not have survived Magnus's upbringing, but she did not have to. She had him. Magnus's thoughts returned to the here and now. Waiting made his skin itch. He did not mind inactivity, but he hated it on someone else's schedule. If the pickup here were only money, Magnus would have simply killed Skinny Stu and been done with it. The MDF could survive without one tribute from one small vacation moon. But because there was sensitive intel also, he forced himself to fight off his natural inclinations and at least meet the new players to see what he was dealing with. Eventually, another shuttle flew in. It was a small military craft, although Magnus did not recognize its configuration. It also looked old in design. It looked like old tech. Old tech was the name for anything left over from the first cycle. The first cycle was the period before the rise of the moons and current civilization. There were ruins and technology left over from a civilization that disappeared millions of cycles ago all over the luminary. Magnus snorted again. "Commander, get the Marines ready." Thalia nodded to the Marine Sergeant. Quietly, the armor on each Marine began to hum a very low noise. Lights illuminated on their arms and chests. Their combat augments were activated, and their battle systems were now online. Thalia's armor lit up also, but Magnus's did not. He wanted to attempt to present a willingness to engage in a dialogue, even though he did not really have one. The old tech ship hovered over the house for a few moments. Clearly, its commander was assessing the tactical situation. After just a short pause, the ship descended and landed in the backyard of a neighbor's house, crushing some type of outdoor food area and children's play equipment. Upon touching down, a back ramp opened, and 2 squads of Batorian shock troops sprinted out of the ship's rear. There were twice as many shock troops as Magnius had Marines. The shock troops were careful not to advance on Magnius and his Marines, instead forming a perimeter to either side of the ramp. Magnius did notice that their armor was also in combat configuration with all its systems activated. After another short pause, 2 larger Batorian soldiers came down the ramp. These were clearly higher-ranking military officers. They were taller than the shock troops, and their armor was more ornate. Behind them was a third entity. It was not a Batorian or any member of the 5 Moons. It was some species that Magnius had never seen before. This could only mean it was an Abraxian, someone from the first cycle. Magnius looked over to Thalia and made a face of impressed surprise. She returned the look. Skinny Stu could not be sweating any more than he currently was. He looked downright miserable. Magnius looked from Thalia to Stuart. "Relax, Stuart. There are some good odds that you survive this." Skinny Stu did not take comfort in the statement. Magnius opened a direct connection to Thalia from his armor. It was a peer-to-peer connection, beaming directly from his suit to hers. This was so he could speak very softly, and she would still hear him, so there was no chance of the signal being intercepted. "Commander," he began, "signal Reason and have them get the combat androids into the drop racks. Put the ship on full combat alert. Have them lower their orbit and calculate a solution to receive our shuttle as quickly as possible should the need arise. Also, have them get a firing solution for that ship." Thalia nodded her head to show she received the communication. Magnius walked forward towards the Abraxian. Stuart whispered very loudly under his breath, "Captain, wait," but Magnius just kept walking. The Abraxian was a very tall figure. It was wearing a hood and long flowing robes made out of genuinely nice but hard-to-get materials. There was just the hint of an aura around it. Maybe it was technology, maybe some other type of energy. Magnius could not make out any facial features because of it. As he drew close, several of the Batorian shock troopers, the Abraxian's guards, stepped between Magnius and the mysterious entity, blocking his way forward. Magnius heard the ammunition cycle in his Marines' weapons. It was an intimidating sound. Skinny Stu stepped up, not between the imposing figures, but near enough to gain their attention. "Whoa, man. Come on," he said to the Abraxian. "I did like you asked. I brought them here just like you told me to. I gotta live here when this is over, man. I don't need more shootouts today." The Abraxian tilted its head, clearly hearing Stuart, but somehow through the robe, projecting the feeling that whatever was about to happen, Skinny Stu would be wise to step away. Magnius was genuinely surprised that Skinny Stu feared this Abraxian more than he feared him. It was a difficult concept, given he had just shot all Stuart's personal protectors inside the house with no warning and no provocation. Magnius heard an echo sound surrounding the Abraxian's speech when it spoke to him. "Greetings, Commander," the Abraxian said. "That's Captain," Thalia shouted. The Abraxian waved its arm as if to say, "Of course," and continued. "Captain," it repeated, keeping its attention on Magnius, "are you capable of delivering a message to your superiors?" Magnius did his best to look the Abraxian in the eye, assuming they were in the same place as on a Machion. All he could see was the darkness inside the hood. The Batorian guards were still standing between him and the hooded figure, preventing a closer view. He quickly weighed his options, knowing a simple, quick assault would be harrowing. They were outnumbered 2-1, and he had no reason to think that the Batorian shock troopers were less capable in any way than his Space Marines. In a close combat firefight, there was limited strategy or cleverness that would change the odds. The Abraxian seemed to sense something. "No, Captain, your troopers are fine fighting soldiers, but you are outnumbered here." Well, that was frustrating. Magnius was sure the thing could not read his thoughts specifically. Still, it did seem to possess some latent ability to pick up on emotions or something close to that. so he decided to answer it. I doubt I would be particularly good as a courier. I tend to misplace things, and I can't follow instructions worth a damn. Captain, the thing said again. Its voice came in 2 or 3 waves, slightly out of sync with each other. You are in no position to enforce your will here. You think that you are strong. In your daily interactions, people show you respect. You believe that it comes from you. You believe that others sense your strength or know of it through past demonstrations, and that is why you are able to command them. But you are not strong. People do not fear you. They fear Mashi and its influence, and they follow you out of trepidation. They want a return from the system they are in. It is what binds them to you. Strength radiates from Machi. Not to the extent of Beitor, but other than the Beitorians, Machi has no military peer among the 5 moons. Magnius was familiar with this argument. It was founded upon the idea that people feared the government and that strength over others was based upon fear. From his experiences, this could be correct, but it was not the only explanation. What do you know of the 5 moons? Magnius asked. He was not interested in the thing's answer, but he was still working to figure out what exactly was going on. Without looking, he knew that reason was slowly moving closer in its stationary orbit and that he needed to buy more time. He was careful not to think about the ship or time. The Abraxian answered, "We know everything. It is you that has amnesia. You do not have knowledge of where you live or of why you live. You do not understand life nor death. Captain, I grow weary of you. Here is your message to deliver to the rulers of Mashi. We have taken your tribute. You no longer have influence over this moon. We will not advance further into your space if you show us the proper respect and send the proper payments. We are offering protection in the luminary now, not you. We also have your blackmail datagrams as an additional incentive. They will remain in confidence as long as your leaders comply." Magnus started to pick up chatter in his peer-to-peer message system. The reason was close enough now to be a factor in the engagement. "Do you have a name?" Magnus asked, ready to finish the conversation. It was hard to tell, but it looked like the Abraxian thing might have smiled. "You may call us Master." Before the strange echo accompanying the thing's speech faded, Magnus and his contingent sprang to action, his combat armor instantly lighting up with its activation. Magnus, Thalia, and their space marines shot up into the air using their flight belts. These were anti-gravity attachments that used magnetics to push against the force of gravity. They were interesting devices that created flight in a gravity environment, but useless in space where gravity was weak. The armor had direct propulsion jets for non-gravity-based movement. At nearly the same instant Magnus and his crew left the ground, several missiles from Reason impacted the area. There would be hell to pay for firing missiles into a civilian neighborhood on a vacation moon, but that would be for later. Chapter 5. Battle Rattle. "Have you found their ships yet?" Magnus yelled over the explosions into his combat armor communications system as he quickly ascended. Ensign Reed replied immediately from Reason. "Sir, we have 6 frigates in counter orbit. I started blocking communications right before we fired our missiles." Reed was yelling back over the connection. "We have a few micros before they know what happened, although they do know now, at a minimum, that they have lost communications with their away team." Magnus watched Thalia come alongside him in the air as he slowed to a stop, saying back to Reed, "Fire the ship-to-ship missiles now. That will take care of half of them." Magnus continued to yell to be heard, even though it was no longer necessary. He and his team were high over the blast area now. It was still loud from the secondary explosions, but not so loud as to hinder communications. "Launch the drones and warm up the FF batteries. Drop the combat androids and have them form on me." He switched over to a private channel with Thalia. "Commander, get back to the ship. Take the Marines with you. The ship is yours until I return. Set up a wide jammer and go ahead and knock out the civilian communications infrastructure." "Yes, sir," Thalia said. "Do you want this to go simple?" she asked. The question meant, did Magnus want prisoners or no survivors? Prisoners were complicated for several reasons. No survivors were simple for the same reasons. "Yes, let's keep things simple until we know how big this whole thing is," Magnus said, losing interest in Thalia. instead watching the small flashes of light that would be the navigation jets firing on the combat androids as they made their drop into the atmosphere. "Yes, sir," she said again and flashed up into the air, with the contingent of Marines right behind her. Magnus refocused back on Thalia as she shot up towards the ship, passing the combat androids in their drop. "Commander, I'll take the androids' counter-rotation. Take the ship the other way. Let's end this quick and keep it as simple as possible." With that, he accelerated, heading to attack the frigates. He moved quickly, but not at full velocity, so the combat androids could catch up to him. The plan was straightforward. He would attack from one side of the moon, Reason from the other. They would strike as quickly as possible and with as much force as possible. It was a short trip around the circumference of the small moon. The combat androids caught up and formed Magnus's favorite attack formation, a combination battle spread ladder. There were 24 androids with him. He and 4 others established the top battle spread, evenly spaced out in a line. Then under each leading unit, 4 units stacked even space below them and slightly trailed, making 5 ladders. It was a very versatile formation that was exceptional in combating ships. They flew low, close to the housing and city structures on the moon, speeding over entertainment areas and industrial areas in equal measure. Magnus had not bothered to study Aegir before. Flying this close to the surface, he was surprised to see the repeating pattern of suburb, city, entertainment, and industrial sections. The moon was actually the same pattern built dozens of times over. Magnus's combat armor was not as sophisticated as the combat androids. They were all armor, ordnance, and launchers. The androids were also powerful, and Magnus had learned long ago that sometimes simply having them smash into the outer hull of a ship and start pulling pieces off was just as effective as a complicated artillery volley or coordinated concussion missile assault. Reason was already engaged when they rounded the moon and got their first view of the enemy ships. As hoped, 3 of the frigates were in pieces, destroyed by the ship-to-ship missiles. Frigates were smaller boats and did not have the advanced firepower of the gunship Reason. They were far from helpless, though, and 3 frigates against a gunship in close quarters fighting was not an even match, the remaining frigates still having an advantage. Commander Thalia was an excellent tactician, and she followed orders as given. Sometimes just doing what you were supposed to do created brilliant strategic scenarios. The frigates had closed the gap to Reason and were pounding her with their FF guns, coordinating their attack, suggesting a competent fleet commander. Magnus acted quickly. He did not have long before the tides would turn and Reason would be disabled. He ordered half the combat androids to attack the outer frigate on one side and half the frigate on the other side of the 3-ship formation. Having reached space, he and the androids' battle armor automatically switched over to the propulsion jets for movement. The heels of the androids burned orange as the gas was forced into the cold of space, dissipating after just the flash of color into the dark void. It would take the 12 combat androids rushing to either ship a few micros to reach their targets. Magnus used the time to survey the area. Wreckage from the destroyed frigates confused the battlefield, but he could make out dozens of escape pods, slowly rotating, waiting for rescue. He had ordered that things be kept simple, and he decided that was still the best course of action, so he activated his targeting systems. Small launchers shot up on either shoulder. Each had 3 small holes along a straight rectangle. His armor did not carry enough ordnance to destroy all the escape pods, so he resisted the urge to fire what he had, instead holding the ammunition in reserve should any of the pods activate movement jets and try to make their way to the moon. The combat androids reached the frigates. This was a combat drill that he had practiced with them thousands of times, so Magnus was confident of the outcome. When the androids were in place, they quickly latched on to the outer side of the hull from the outside ships. They fired their jets at maximum thrust, in coordination and the same direction, all at once. The force rotated the outer frigates off their axis, retargeting their FF guns at the center ship. The move was so quick that the ship's automatic systems did not have the chance to correct the rotation or pause the ship-to-ship artillery bombardment. Reason focused its guns on the center frigate, and suddenly it exploded, overwhelmed by the repeated concussions. Thalia, knowing the strategy, had kept Reason just far enough away to not be impacted by the explosion. The other two frigates were not as lucky, and their lights and power source visibly flickered as the massive blast washed over them. The combat androids push off and away from each ship, firing their jets to move backwards while firing their rocket launchers forward at the underbelly of each ship. Almost immediately, the remaining two frigates exploded. Many of the original escape pods were destroyed in the blasts. The final ships were detonating so quickly that their crews did not have time to even issue an abandon ship instruction, the concussive blast so forceful it obliterated the pods closest to it. As the battlefield cleared, Magnus inventoried the remaining escape pods. There were 17 still intact. He quickly scanned for signals and found one broadcasting on a different frequency, meaning it likely had an officer on board. He ordered that pod retrieved and sent the remaining combat androids to the other pods to pull them apart so there would be no other survivors. Sometimes simple was the best approach. Chapter 6: Aftermath. There were 2 officers on the escape pod, Commander Thalia told Magnus as he returned to the bridge and walked over to his command station. "We have a male who is wearing the uniform of an engineer and a female who is wearing the uniform of a navigator," she continued. Magnus held up a hand as he went through the command station message queue. "We don't need 2. Do the interrogators have a recommendation?" he asked her, not finding anything interesting in the messages. Thalia checked something. "They think the male is senior in rank. Beyond that, no." Magnus thought for a moment. "Okay, well, rank has its privileges. Jettison her into space and run him through standard protocols 1 through 3. No need to preserve. This is not a catch and release. Tell them that for any parts they don't need, they are free to dispose of them if it moves things along." Thalia grimaced, knowing what this meant, but she sent the order exactly as it was given, then asked Magnus, "It's going to take some time before we hear anything, so what do you want to do about the civilian government?" "We knocked out their communications infrastructure and are still actively jamming any redundant or backup signals. Nothing is getting out or in, and they are not able to communicate with each other beyond how loud they can yell." Magnus looked down at his command board and made a few keystrokes, putting Thalia in for a medal. She had performed flawlessly, and he was proud of her. The situation could have been a disaster, but they had used the correct combination of strength, planning, and wisdom to see it through. However, fighting 6 frigates over a civilian moon and dealing with an Abraxian were not common occurrences. There was a lot of information they still needed to understand the real situation, whatever it may be. He smiled when he had an idea. "Commander, go ahead and send a Marine in full battle loadout to each of the local government regions. Give them instruction for reactivating the communication arrays. Make sure it will take them several days to do it. Have the Marine tell each region that the full tribute is required by them right now. That should what? Quadruple the amount." It was a rhetorical question, but she nodded anyway, smiling. "Reactivate the banking network," he continued. "Give one the MDF account number, one our private account number, and the other 2 the account we use for the crew. By the time communications are restored and they figure out we collected the full amount from each region, we will be long gone. I doubt they will care. We just earned the entire year's tribute amount in a day." "Yes, sir." She saluted back and got to work. A salute was not required on the bridge for such an order, but she did it anyway. Much later, after the tributes had been secured and the area around the moon patrolled to ensure there were no other dangers, the crew rotated to the night shift. Magnus was restless, still waiting on the results of the prisoner interrogation. He walked the ship and eventually got bored of crew members jumping out of his way and standing at attention. He checked with the combat engineers. The ship had suffered minor damage, which was rapidly being addressed. The crew knew their jobs and were experts in their fields. The combat androids were in better condition. None had taken any real damage or even a direct hit. The ship had fired most of its ordnance, so he dispatched another contingent of Marines to go down to the moon and procure replacement armaments from the MDF stores there, so Reason could leave with a full loadout. He ate in the mess. Eventually, he walked by Thalia's cabin. As he was approaching her door, 2 male crew members were exiting. Their uniforms were disheveled, and one had a black eye and swollen ear. As Magnus approached, they saw him and snapped to attention, still not completely put back together. Magnus stopped in front of them. "Soldier, your uniform is not to regulation," he said to one of the men. "Yes, sir," the crewman returned, staring at Magnus's forehead. Magnus stood there just long enough to make the officer uncomfortable and allow doubt to creep into the situation. He said, "Don't let it happen again on my boat, soldier. Dismissed." Both crewmen quickly scrambled away. Magnus hit the mechanism to open Thalia's door. As the captain of the ship, he never needed to request permission to enter any area. Her cabin was large, the size of 4 standard officers' cabins. There were comfortable chairs, a large, unmade, recently used bed, a small private kitchen, and a hot tub. They often used the skim from their collection duties to augment personal living spaces on the ship. Her cabin paled compared to Magnus's, but was 100 times nicer than regulations required. Thalia was in the hot tub, relaxing. When she heard the door open, she must have assumed it was one of the men who had just left, so she did not open her eyes to look over. Magnus stood there for a moment, then cleared his throat. She opened her eyes, which got wide when she recognized who it was. Without thinking, she jumped up out of the water to attention. Magnus made a show of turning his head. "Good Lord, Commander, as you were, at ease." She smiled and sat back down into the silently bubbling water. Magnus unbuttoned the top button of his uniform and relaxed, a common military indication from a superior to a subordinate that the conversation would be casual, using the single button and relaxed demeanor to suggest a lowering of military courtesies. He walked over and pulled one of the comfortable chairs up next to the hot tub. While he did this, Thalia asked, "So what's the plan, Captain?" Magnus gave her a thin smile, sitting down in the chair next to her. "No plan yet. Well, I guess the current plan is to get more information." She nodded. "Thalia, I wanted to talk to you about the promotion ceremony. It is hard to believe it was only yesterday." She went cold, doing everything she could not to show it. Magnus noticed and said, "No, Commander. I was pleased with your performance. But I want to discuss what happened, and I want you to understand why I was happy about it." She swallowed, having known Magnus for a long time and believing he would not betray her trust now with a faux explanation. So this must be a real conversation, not a setup. "Yes, sir. I know we wanted more of a show, but when Lieutenant Graciela used that silly basic training attack move, I could not let the mistake go unpunished." "Yes, I agree." Magnus was speaking with a fatherly tone. "But you did not necessarily have to follow the move up with a near decapitation." He watched her closely, looking for indications of her thinking. "Begging your pardon, sir." Thalia firmed up just a bit. Independent of this conversation and its setting, there were some universal truths to combat that Magnus himself had taught her. As soon as she applied for the promotion, I gained the right, in that setting, to do anything I wanted to her. When she attacked me with an insulting maneuver, she lost her standing as a valued member of the crew. She had no option of returning to duty. She was worthless, not having learned even basic lessons from basic training. The crew would have known that I was capable of ending the fight right there, and I would have lost respect with them if I did anything but what I did. Then we would have been down 2 officers, not just 1. It was a good answer, and Magnus knew he had made the right choice for his first officer. She had proven this over and over. He knew it, and the crew knew it. It was rare in the MDF that a ship had 2 corps officers able to command together. It made reason a powerful asset. What about today with Skinny Stew? Do you see any similarities? Thalia thought for a moment. She had not expected the question. "No, sir. Today looked to me just like our standard strategy. Look weak when you are strong, strong when you are weak. Attack instead of defend. Plan until you can attack. Limit effort to the things that drive victory. Keep things as simple as possible." Magnus smiled a genuine smile. "Yes, Commander, but I meant with Skinny Stew and the Abraxian." She went deep in thought. "You mean with that babble about strength? I was on the comms for some of it and did not pay close attention. I figured you had it covered." Magnus cut to the point. The Abraxian wanted us to deliver a message to Mashi. Basically, that there is a new player in town. They seem to want the same territory that we have. One Abraxian does not make an invasion force, sir, she said, thinking on her feet. Magnus nodded. He agreed with her assessment. No, it does not, Commander. He stood, patting her on the hand, which she took much more pride and pleasure in than she expected to. It was the first sign of familiarity he had ever offered her one-on-one. After that, the moment was over. He straightened, buttoned his top uniform button, and left the room, headed to his cabin to get some sleep. Tomorrow would bring the results of the interrogation, the clearing of the tribute payment, and the need to decide on a new course of action. The end.